Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.
Welcome to mini episode 357 of Real Life Ghost Stories, and I have 3 spooky stories for you today, and the last story comes from April the 13th, 2024, and story number 1 comes from Natalie. My mother passed back in 2022 right after I graduated high school. We were going to go down to Savannah because she had just been released from prison after 8 months. She was supposedly clean the entire time and even bragged on occasion about how she flushed other inmates' weed down the toilet right in front of them. I believed she was finally changed. She lasted exactly 19 days. The next time she used, it had fentanyl laced inside and was her end. I feel it was a mercy. She believed in ghosts and the paranormal just as much as I do, along with most things occult. A couple of days before she passed, we were out eating and talking about what we thought happened in the afterlife. Naturally, we disagreed. While she liked to let her head fly in the clouds, I felt it was my place to bring her back down. But that didn't mean I wasn't open to suggestions either. The first incident occurred a week or so after she passed. I was laying in bed at about 2 a.m. reading with no music or sounds, and I heard 3 distinguishable knocks next to my bedroom window, which was essentially the wall I was pressed up against that led outside. If it was someone trying to make a scene or wake me up, why didn't they knock on the front door, which was directly to the left of my bedroom? And if they knew me, why not on the window itself? Why on the wall in between the door and the window? Scared the hell out of me, and I waited for more noise, but it never came. I was laying in the pitch dark on my loft bed, vaguely scared and comforted simultaneously. Part of me wanted it to be her. I still believe it was her trying to find her way in. A few days later, I had a very vivid nightmare. I was walking down the hill of our house. The sky was black and there was a song playing in my head, generally playing over the dream. It was a Native American song that my mom used to listen to, very traditional. Halfway down the hill, my stomach dropped and I knew I was in a nightmare and something was about to scare me. But I consciously decided to stay in the dream to see what it was. Don't judge. Anyway, come to find out, along the tree line, my mother came barreling out, yelling my name like she was scared and lost. Her eyes were blotted out and her jaw was unhinged. She was only wearing a white gown, one that went to her feet and covered her arms. I stayed still and let her come to me. I didn't want her to be scared. It was like in life, I was her stability. She came to me for comfort or advice. So I stood at the bottom of the hill and watched as she threw herself into my arms, wailing my name over and over. And I found I was saying "Mom" repeatedly. I woke up in the middle of saying the word. The dream made me feel that she couldn't find her way, that she was lost somewhere around the house. For context, she died in the house, in the middle of the day in her bedroom. It was one of those rainy days, but the sun still shone, where you could watch mist rise up off the asphalt from the heat and the moisture combining. I imagine she did find her way eventually, because she developed the habit of waking me up. I was unemployed for a year after graduating because the throes of grief had me in its grip. I'd only recently started applying. And one day, during one of my cat naps, I felt her tug the back of my exposed shirt to wake me. It did, in fact, wake me, and I looked over my shoulder where the tug was. There my phone was, lit up because I was being called back for an interview. Usually my phone is on silent, so I wouldn't have woken up to catch this call on my own. It's so like her to be on top of things like that when I was down. Balanced each other out in a weird way. She'd probably be super excited to know she was being talked about on here. I only wish I could ask her what the afterlife turned out to be. It ate us both up, and it kills me now to think that she finally got her answer and can't tell me. I'm always very conscious on the podcast that I just spend a lot of time repeating myself. Do you know what I mean? So I apologise if I'm repeating myself pretty much, every episode or every couple of episodes. But I really do think that it is the comfort that you take from it is what's important. Like I always say, we can rationalise our way out of anything. But after somebody that we love passes away and you feel like this thing has happened and I believe that was that person trying to tell me that they're okay, then that's what's important. And I do think it's interesting that you and your mum were really into the occult and, the paranormal and discussions about what came next and what happened in the afterlife. And then you had that experience of the 3 knocks when you were in bed. And the 3 knocks, as I've spoken about before in Irish culture, is symbolic of death and the afterlife. And in other cultures too, not just Irish culture. And I love the fact that your mum is in the habit of waking you up when you need her to. It must be very comforting to know that your mum is there looking out for you in the afterlife and making sure you don't miss those important phone calls. And I always hope that when people write in these stories that there's a sense of catharsis, that you feel like, it's healing and therapeutic to write it down. And then I hope that people listening gain something from it too. And story number 2 comes from Alexandra. I wanted to share a few things with you about my son Joshua. He is a teenager now and a pretty standard gamer with an aversion to showering. But when he was little, he was a creepy little weirdo. I love him to bits, honestly. I know you're always questioning kids who talk well. Both of my kids talked early. I love to read and I was a stay-at-home mum, so I read with them a lot. Maybe that helped. When Joshua was small, definitely before he was in preschool, so under 3, we had some strange conversations. He once asked me about his other house. We moved when he was 5 months old and there was no way he could have remembered the previous place. So I said, "You won't remember our old house, sweetheart." "No, my house, the house I lived in alone." I laughed. "You've never been alone, you're too little to live alone." He got a bit frustrated then, probably because he didn't have the vocabulary to explain. "The house I lived in before, when I was a grown-up. You weren't there, none of you were there." We were sitting on the floor, probably playing with cars or Duplo or something. I was trying to figure out what he could mean and I couldn't get my head around it. I asked him to tell me more about the house. There were windows, but without glass in them. He didn't know glass, but smacked his hand on the patio door to ask me what it was called. And none of you were there and no one had cars. He meant me, his dad and his sister. I don't know how he could have known there were no cars in the past at his age then. As we talked more, I worked out there was no electricity, no TV, and he kept chickens. A few more snippets came out over a few months. I've forgotten most of them now, but gradually he stopped talking about his past life. That's what I've assumed it was, memories of a previous life that faded after he fully settled into this one. I wondered if he had more memories when he was younger and just didn't have the capability of speech to articulate them then. Some of the details he came out with were so specific. I read books to him, and the TV only went on for a little while when his sister came home from school in the living room next to the kitchen. I knew what they were watching, and I don't think it came from the TV or what I was reading to him. I believe it was real, not imagination. The second incident you're really not going to like. Sorry. We had a strange layout in the ground floor of the house. You could walk in a circle from the front door through to the kitchen, dining room, living room, down the corridor alongside the playroom and straight back to the front door. My husband and I decided if we walked up the end of the corridor by the front door, we could then knock the playroom wall down and take the width of the corridor into the playroom. Bigger playroom and no draft from the front door whistling down the corridor into the living room. Win. So we got the builders in. One morning I was sat with Joshua while he ate lunch. My husband was at work and his sister at primary school. Joshua suddenly asked, "When will the screaming lady go away?" I sat in stunned silence for a few seconds and then I asked, "What screaming lady, sweetheart?" He waved a chubby little hand indistinctly in the air. The screaming lady, she walks all around screaming. When will she go away? I resisted the urge to take him upstairs just so I could drop kick him back down them, and instead said, I haven't seen a screaming lady. He looked at me like I was stupid. You can't see her and she can't see you. When will she go away? I thought about the building work, and I said, she'll probably go away when the builders finish the job. She probably just doesn't like the mess and the noise. He nodded and went back to his meal. A few weeks later, the work was finished. We had decorated and put a new playroom floor down. I was in the playroom with Joshua. I asked him if he still saw the screaming lady. He knelt up, looked around, and smiled a huge smile like he'd only just realised. She's not here now, he said. I've no idea what the hell the screaming lady was. Joshua can't remember any of this. We've since moved house again, so hopefully she stayed at the old house. So far, no one's come out with anything creepy in this house, but it's old, built in the 1800s. The previous owner was here for over 50 years and died last week. We have a teenage daughter as well, so I'm expecting the poltergeist activity to start any day now. Oh, babe, it's only a matter of time before it goes all poltergeist in your house. What, with a teenage girl in the house with a history of freaky kids? Alexandra, that tree is going to come through your window any moment. This really made me laugh. Like, I enjoyed it so much. Honestly, kids are such freaky little weirdos. Why are they such freaky little weirdos? These stories about kids who are chatting about their past lives, like, they are really compelling. You know, to be able to say, I was living in this house and I didn't have a car and there was no glass in the windows, there was no electricity, but I kept chickens. Like, there's nothing in kids' TV programs is talking about past lives, you know? And as for the screaming lady, I mean, she can fuck right off. That is terrifying. And they do say, I mean, they as in, I don't know who they is, but they do say that building work disturbs entities and ghosts and can rattle up paranormal activity and poltergeists. And apparently in this case, a woman who just goes around the house screaming. And I totally understand. I would have been like, Joshua, we need to go to the top of the stairs so I can kick you forcefully down them. Kids are wild, honestly. They just blow my mind.
Hey everyone, I'm Craig Robinson, co-host of the Ways to Win podcast, alongside my good friend John Calipari. I've been on the go recently. Phoenix, Kansas City, Chicago. If you're like me and have a home but aren't always at home, you have an Airbnb. Hosting your home or a spare room is a very practical side hustle. If you live in a big game town, you can Airbnb your place for fans to stay in. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.
And story number 3 comes from Dana. My first experience beyond the normal happened when I was around 10 years old. I grew up going to church, and even though I love Jesus, the idea of him coming back, taking everyone away, and evil things happening at the apocalypse is pretty terrifying. I used to pray, please God, keep my family safe, except for my sister because she's mean. Make Sean Cassidy fall in love with me, and please, please, please don't come back anytime soon. Amen. One night I woke up needing to pee. I tiptoed down the hall to the bathroom where I beheld a cross, a golden cross, in the middle of the bathroom window shining down upon me. It was a beautiful, glowing cross with flared arms. I stood there trembling, certain that God had not answered my prayers and that this was it. Were people all over the world seeing this cross right now too? Should I wake up my family and let them know? But wait. If they couldn't see it, then they were going to get left behind, and that would be awful. Except for my sister, because it served her right. I couldn't wait any longer and decided Jesus wouldn't mind if I peed before going to heaven, so I hurriedly did my business. Should I bother to flush? Nah, flushing the toilet at the end of the world seemed petty. I continued to stand in the bathroom gazing at the cross and waiting for the trumpets to sound. Minutes passed and nothing happened. More minutes passed and my feet started to get cold. I returned to bed and eventually fell back asleep. As with most apocalyptic scenarios, it ended up being nothing. The cross no longer appeared in the window at night. The end of days was not nigh. I figured maybe I was just a saint or something. Years passed and I forgot about the event until I was a young adult, home from college. Once again I tiptoed to the bathroom in the middle of the night to do my business, and there was the cross, gold and glowing in the pebbled window just like before. My mind rushed back to my childhood experience, and with the wisdom of adulthood upon me, I wasn't having any of this fake second coming crap. I walked to the window and raised the glass to meet my fate head on if needed. Turns out there was a small light on the side of my neighbour's house that they only turned on every 10 years or so, apparently. The pebbled glass refracted the light in a way that looked like a cross. By then I already knew I wasn't a saint, so no disappointment, but it was nice to finally have the mystery solved. My next experience was not humorous, and warning, it involves infant death. A recent college graduate in the midst of a recession, I took the only job I could find working for an agency that provided rental assistance for people in need. One of my jobs was to walk through rentals and ensure they were safe and livable before the agency agreed to help with rent. That job taught me that humans are much more terrifying than anything else, and that my sister really wasn't that bad after all. One day I met a new client and landlord at a vacant home the client was about to move into. It rarely happened, but both the landlord and the tenant were lovely people, and the house was in great shape. I enjoyed talking with them as we walked the house, and I checked the light switches, outlets, locks, appliances, etc. We stepped into the back bedroom and suddenly my blood ran cold. I felt an immediate heaviness of dread that I've never felt before, which was quickly turning into panic. I started backing out of the room, bumping into the two other people and saying, "Everything in here looks fine." I'd been so thorough in every other room that they looked at me strangely but didn't question me. I'd never experienced a feeling like that in my life, and afterward only experienced it one other time. The inspection complete, I suggested we go outside to finish the paperwork. I couldn't get out of that house fast enough. I went on with my day, and honestly I tried not to think about what had happened. My biggest fear was that the tenant would have a problem with the house and it would be my fault. What actually happened was far worse. A few months later, the client appeared at my office to meet with me. She said she would have to drop out of the program, and then she broke down in tears. Her boyfriend had killed her infant son in the house. Although I was trying to be empathetic and professional, I remember my blood rushing in my ears and feeling like I was going to faint. I am certain that whatever horrible thing happened in that house, it happened in that bedroom. I'm not psychic, nor do I have premonitions, but I know there was something evil in that room. I often wonder if I should have said something. Maybe I could have stopped the tragedy that happened there. But it did teach me to listen to my body and not ignore my feelings, and I am much better at speaking up when something isn't right. My next odd story happened many years later, when my now adult youngest daughter was 18 months old. She has always been sensible and athletic, even as a toddler, so I didn't always need to hold her hand. We were walking into a luncheon at church, and she was dancing along a few steps in front of me. My arms were full of potluck foods. Well, okay, chips and salsa because I don't cook. And we were about to walk down a set of wide concrete steps into the room where the luncheon was happening. I was greeting friends who were setting up when I saw my daughter start to stumble. She was definitely tripping and about to fall. Her body was well past the point of no return, maybe a 45-degree angle or further. It was one of those moments that went in slow motion, and I knew she would be hurt falling down those hard steps. I was steeling myself for first aid when suddenly she stopped tipping forward and slowly righted herself. It wasn't a flailing her arms and finding her balance thing. It was as though someone stopped her in the middle of her fall and pushed her upright again. I was frozen to the spot, while she took off down the stairs to find her friends. I looked down at the other women, and they were also frozen, staring back at me. Did you guys just see what I just saw? There were about 5 of them there who saw the same thing. Something invisible stopped her from having a terrible accident, and I am so grateful. Maybe she's the saint instead of me. A few years later, my saucy and stylish grandmother died on New Year's Eve. She was always a party girl, and my mother and I actually contemplated putting a New Year's party hat on her body before the funeral home removed her from the retirement facility. Honestly, I kind of regret not doing it. She would have loved it. Later that night, I was home watching television by myself, trying to wind down after an emotional day when I heard a noise. It sounded like my youngest had gotten out of bed, put on her plastic princess heels, and was walking on the wood floors in the hallway. I jumped up to put her back in bed, only to find her sound asleep. Several minutes later, I remembered my grandmother always wore fancy slippers with feather tufts on top. They would make clackety sounds as she walked, and she loved it. I'm pretty sure this was her, clacketing by to say farewell in her own stylish way. About 20 years later, I've never heard another mysterious sound in our house. It still makes me smile to think of it. Several years ago, my gorgeous oldest daughter and I took a girls' trip to Scotland and England. She and I are both fans of real-life ghost stories, so we stopped by the Banshee Labyrinth, where the only scary thing we saw was the bathroom. Then we made our way to a midnight tour of the Edinburgh tunnels. It was a fantastic tour and not nearly as scary as the sweet tour guide tried to make it. As we were walking from one room to the next, we were at the very back of the group at the time. My daughter jumped and spun around. And she said, "Oh, did you pull my hair?" I laughed and said, "Yeah, sorry. Did I scare you?" She said it startled her because she heard that people often had their hair pulled in there. The rest of the tour went great and we enjoyed the best vacation ever. Last year we were looking through our lovely trip photos when I finally decided to tell her the truth. I did not pull her hair. My final story is when I toured the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky. I was in Louisville on business and a group of us decided to take a tour of the most haunted place in America. It was a slow day at the sanatorium, and how often do you hear that phrase? And we were the only ones on the tour. It was fascinating to learn the history of the beautiful building. The guide, of course, told us all the ghost stories, but we didn't experience anything. We went into one of the 2 operating rooms, and for only the second time in my life, I felt that same feeling I did in that room in that house all those years ago. A cold, heavy dread turning into panic. I noped out of the room and waited in the hall for the rest of the group. For the rest of the tour, I was fighting the desire to cry. I don't want to know what happened in that room, but it wasn't good. Other than the one horrible story I will never get over, my paranormal experiences have been fairly tame. Turns out I'm not a saint and Sean Cassidy never fell in love with me. But I've had some unusual experiences I can't explain, which I'm happy to be able to share with you. Oh, and it turns out my sister is actually pretty cool after all. I'm glad she didn't end up getting left behind. Oh, the joys of being a young person, being a child and being like, I hate my siblings. When the rapture comes, don't rapture them, okay? Because they're just going to make my life a misery in the afterlife. And everything about this just brings me such joy. Do you know, going to the toilet, thinking the rapture is coming because there's a glowing cross in the window. Fair. Like, totally understand how a child would be like, oh my God, shit, it's the rapture. But then being like, oh, my feet are actually starting to get cold. This rapture is taking a really long time. I'm just going to go to sleep. And then I'll be raptured in the morning and it'll be fine. And then it's like, oh no, maybe I'm just a saint. Kids are hilarious, man. I mean, I'm glad the end of the world didn't come and none of us were raptured. That's pretty good. And Dana, I can't help but agree. Like, our bodies detect things way before our brains do, you know? They give us those feelings of panic and those feelings of like, you need to get out of this room. Like, you need to not be here. And sometimes you just don't know why. And then it turns out that it's something pretty horrendous. I know somebody who met a man, and was, the man didn't do anything untoward. There was no sort of like negativity, nothing like that. And they had dinner as a group. And afterwards she said, I never want to see that man again. I don't know what it is. I just cannot be around that man. And the people around her were like, what are you talking about? Like, he was absolutely fine. He's a perfectly nice man. And he went on to brutally murder somebody. And she had no basis for disliking him, only a gut feeling of something is wrong. I do not want to be around you for whatever reason. My body is telling me that I am not safe in this situation, and I need to be away from this. It's wild what intuition can tell you if you listen to it. And we've had a number of stories over the years where kids have fallen off things, fallen downstairs, fallen off buildings, fallen out of windows, and they have felt like they have floated down, or that somebody has lifted them down the height that they were falling, and they've sort of landed perfectly fine at the bottom. Like, is that a guardian angel thing? Is that some sort of whatever way you want to look at it? Is it a guardian angel? Is it a guardian entity, a guardian spirit? And I'm glad the kind of other women were there to witness it, because I think otherwise you'd end up second guessing yourself and be like, no, I definitely didn't see that. Your grandmother sounds absolutely amazing. What a woman. Those clickety clackety fluffy slippers are like the ultimate glamorous woman accessory. 100%. So how lovely that in the afterlife she is bopping, clicking and clacking around in her gorgeous feathery slippers. Love that. I less love the idea of being in the Edinburgh Vaults and getting my hair pulled. That, honestly, it's one of those places that is on my list of places to go, and I really want to go, but I'm also really scared to go. And Waverly Hills is also big time on my list of places to go. I would love to go to Waverly Hills. Of all paranormal, spooky places, I think Waverly Hills is fascinating, and it makes sense that you would get that cold, heavy dread feeling in rooms in Waverly Hills, because it was pretty grim. It was a pretty grim place. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you to Natalie, Alexandra and Dana for sending in your stories. Remember, the last story came from April the 13th, 2024. And if you would like to send your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website at reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.